together! My name is Tanja and welcome to my channel. Today I'm making a video about how to sew on a budget. Because as you might know, I'm a student and I find myself quite often in situations where I can't spend that much money on fabric, especially compared to other sewing vloggers which seem to do loads and loads of hauls featuring meters of designer fabric and lots of indie patterns. So over the course of the last few months I collected my tips on how you can make the most out of a situation like this anyway. I have tips on how to buy fabric, how to buy patterns, how to buy pattern magazines, how to use fabric and patterns, and tips about spending and saving for spending for fabric in general. Of course, if you want to save on fabric, you can buy less expensive fabric. That's kind of obvious. However, you shouldn't buy the really cheap stuff. I'd suggest that you spend your money on less expensive types of fabric, meaning probably cotton. This is usually a quite inexpensive fabric, at least compared to silk or wool or that kind of stuff. My next tip is buying just as much fabric for a project as you need. So if you know before you go to the fabric store which project you're searching fabric for, that's great, because you can then buy just the amount of fabric the pattern recommends, or you can even lay out your pattern pieces on your floor and measure out if you probably even get them onto less fabric, because usually that's the case. Pattern designers always recommend you to buy more fabric than you actually need, so by measuring it out yourself and rearranging the pattern pieces you can sometimes save up to a meter of fabric. In case you don't know the exact pattern you'll use when you buy your fabric, you can even specify it by thinking of a category of garments you use the fabric for. For example, if you know that you want to make a top out of the fabric, you obviously need less fabric than if you want to make a dress or a gown or trousers. So I'd recommend you to have a look how much fabric your standard patterns need, meaning how much a typical blouse or probably a little flowier blouse needs if you tend to make these, how much a t-shirt needs, how much trousers need, and writing that down somewhere on a list you take then to the fabric store or in your phone where you always have it. So for example, if I see a fabric somewhere I know I want to make some kind of top out of, then I'll go and purchase 80 or 90 centimeters because I know that is enough for my size. And even if it has to be a little flowier, or if the sleeves are long, or if I add a ruffle somewhere, I know that this will be enough. So I don't even have to purchase a full meter. And you can save a lot of money too if you use that tip. My next tip is about dealing with expensive fabrics, because sometimes it just happens that you stumble upon an expensive fabric and you have to have it. My tip here is to go for patterns which just use a tiny amount of fabric. So probably something like the ogden-cami, or just use them at the sleeves and the neckband in a otherwise white tee or something like that. Find a way to incorporate the fabric into a pattern, or find a pattern that uses a small amount of fabric so that you don't have to buy masses of this fabric, but you still have it in your wardrobe. Tip number 4. Don't use the layout plan of a pattern. The pattern pieces usually aren't arranged there the most economical way, because pattern designers arrange the pieces for multiple sizes. And yes, sometimes they split the layout plan for different sizes. However, they usually expect you to cut all the pieces with the fabric folded once. But I find that it makes a huge difference, especially on patterns that have a lot of small pieces, when you unfold the fabric and then cut your pieces at once on one single layer of fabric. You really have a lot less waste then. Tip number 5 is to go for fabrics that have either smaller prints or bigger prints you don't need to line up, or take care you don't cut on the wrong place. Because you then can arrange all your pieces the most economical way and don't have to worry to cut into the main part of the print. Another thing that has helped me a lot is to choose prints that are non-directional or that work at a 90-degree angle too. because sometimes you can lay them in a more economical way if you just turn anything 90 degrees. However, just make sure that you cut all your pieces either on the grain line or in a 90-degree angle to the grain line, because otherwise it will distort when you wash it. Tip number 6 is to accommodate the pattern to the fabric if you don't have enough fabric to just cut out your pattern pieces. Sometimes it's just more fabric saving to divide one pattern piece into two, plus adding a seam allowance. Probably for large circle skirt panels that have to be cut in one big piece, you don't have to do that. You can divide it if you don't bother having a seam there. Sometimes you can then place these pieces in a way that other pieces fit onto the fabric better as well, and then you get everything out of your fabric. Doesn't work for every fabric, but sometimes you just see that you can do something. My next tip is to use your scraps. Sometimes you might not have big scraps, but probably you find a matching fabric in your stash that you can then use to patchwork a garment together. Probably make the bodice for a shirt out of one fabric and the sleeves out of another. Sometimes that works, and you can even use your smaller scraps. Of course, another way to use scraps would be to make just little things. I find that making smaller bags or pencil cases or lingerie is a great way to do this. Okay, now let's talk about sewing patterns. The easiest way, in my opinion, to save on sewing patterns is not buying many and buy cheap ones. However, you can't always do that. So I'd suggest, if you want to buy an expensive pattern, before you buy it, really think about how often you're gonna use it, how much value it will add to your closet or your pattern stash, things like that. What I do is to imagine 3 garments I could make out of this pattern, and if I think I'm gonna use it more than 3 times, I can go ahead and buy it. This strategy works for sewing magazines with patterns in them as well. Just set yourself a rule. If there are 2 or 3 or 4 patterns in the magazine I like, I buy it. If not, I don't. Something you find useful. So make this rule for you with a number that suits your sewing habits, and then every time before you want to buy a pattern or a magazine or whatever, ask yourself if you're within that rule. If not, don't get the pattern. If you don't want to buy a pattern at all, there are loads of free patterns on the internet. There are websites which collect huge amounts of free sewing patterns with links to blogs where most of them are from. Some designers even offer free patterns, some indie designers do this. Burda Style has a section of free patterns, and some other designers in general do this as well. So just go to your favorite designers' pages and have a look if they have some kind of free patterns or free download section where you can get 1 or 2 patterns for free. And my third source of free patterns are sewing magazines. There are several UK-based magazines, I think, which come with patterns and instructions in their magazines, but then you can download the pattern pieces, so the PDF pattern printout sheets, on their websites. Sometimes you get the instructions with the PDF download on the website, sometimes not, and you have to figure out yourself how to put the pattern together, but you can find some really nice patterns there. Sometimes even patterns from well-known designers like Sew Over It, Tilly and the Buttons, The Great British Sewing Bee. I'll link all of the download sections of these magazines below, so you can check them out if you find something that's there. If a pattern has the instructions to make it not with it, but in the magazine, you can either then get the magazine, probably you find it somewhere secondhand on Amazon or on a cardboard sale, or you can choose a garment where you know how to make it and then just figure out yourself how you have to put it together. For things like easy skirts or dresses or blouses, it's usually not that hard. And sometimes if they are designer patterns, you probably even find a sew along on the internet or on YouTube somewhere. My next tip is to try to self-draft your patterns, meaning starting with easier things like probably a t-shirt or a kimono or something that isn't that difficult but that you can actually make yourself. And as soon as you have drafted some simpler things and read about techniques and stuff, you'll notice that your skills improve and that you can actually make a lot of things without buying a pattern. And my last tip in this section is to use ready-to-wear clothes you might still have in your closet and just copy their shape. Sometimes it's really easy, for example for t-shirts without any pleats or anything in them. Just make sure you add enough allowance for the hem and the seams, and that way you don't need to buy a pattern for a basic t-shirt. You can just make up your own from a garment that you know that fits well. That's another benefit of this method. You can take garments you know that fit you and you see the fit before you sew up the garment, because you can try it on first and then just look for a similar fabric and replicate that item. Last but not least, I have some tips for you about spending in general. My first tip is to wait for the sales. The next big sale coming up will be the Black Friday sale, which a lot of designers take part. Then there will be a January sale usually, a spring sale around Easter, and we just had the summer sale. So there are at least 4 big sales in the year, which a lot of pattern designers and fabric stores take part in. So keep these sales in mind and really prepare for them. Firstly, if you plan to get a few things, so save a little bit in advance so that with the sale you wouldn't spend more than you would without. And then especially for things like patterns that you wouldn't sew right now because they're probably not for the current season, but you're planning ahead and you know you want to get that pattern, wait for the next sale, because there will come a sale. Roughly every 3 months there will be a sale. The same with fabric. If you know you want a certain fabric from a certain website but you don't need it now, put it into the wish list on this fabric website and wait for a sale, and probably it gets discounted when the sale starts and then you can go ahead and get it. Sometimes you might just feel like you want to shop for fabric because you need inspiration or you are bored, and then you go fabric shopping and spend money on that trip. A solution for that problem is to go shopping online and put your fabric first onto a wish list and then keep it on this wish list for at least 2 weeks. In some fabric stores that's not possible because the fabric will be sold out by then, but just go to a website that has its fabric in stock longer and keep it in your wish list for this time. And then after 2 weeks, go over your wish list and decide if you still need these fabrics. And often you can put a lot of fabrics out of your wish list then, but the ones that are still in there then, you know you really like and you can purchase probably at a later point in the month when you have saved up enough fabrics. Another great thing is to set yourself a budget and then track all your expensive sewing related and try to be within that budget. Really try to stay within that. The great thing is that you then aren't spending more. The other thing is that as soon as you track all your expenses, you can really see how much you spend on what, and you can really get an overview how much you actually spend or would like to spend. One tip about the budget though, don't make it too high or too low. Set a budget that you can stay within, but don't set the number too high. Make it a little bit of a challenge to stay within that budget. And with time, you see, you get a lot better with planning your expenses ahead to stay within that budget. And my last tip is to put your sewing budget together with another budget you have that you would like to reduce. For example, for me, that was my spendings on clothes, because if I sew, I don't have to buy that many clothes. So I have one big budget for clothes and sewing. However, I'm not spending any money for clothes anymore because I just like buying fabric more and I feel like I get more joy from that. So just because I could reduce my spendings on this other subject, I now have more money to spend on fabric and sewing stuff. These were all my tips. I hope you found them useful. If you did so, please give me a thumbs up. Subscribe if you aren't subscribed yet, and I hope to see you soon with another video. Till then, stay well and goodbye!